Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Scott M. Graves, and you are about to hear the next episode of SMG's Are We Here Yet podcast. We are extremely excited on this, I would say snowy evening. It's more like an ice storm out here in New England right now in February 2021, but we are really excited for the show that we have for you this evening. As always, the loyal and intrepid and effervescent producer and co-host extraordinaire Cam McLeod is calling us from the wilds of New Hampshire. How's it going out there, man?
Oh, it's going, man. It's going. Yeah, haven't. I think it's slowing down a little bit up here, but dealing with the fun storm is very swell. I almost slipped on my own stairwell like 3 times today.
It's February. It's New England. We love it because ultimately, in a couple of days, we'll go outside. We'll have fun in it. You know, as long as it's not all ice. You know, it is what it is.
Right there you go. There you go. Make the best of it.
We also have a past guest of the Are We Here Yet podcast with us this evening from Western Mass. He is an excellent writer, poet extraordinaire, and a wonderful person, a wonderful artist. And I wanted him to join us tonight for many reasons. Mr. Joshua Michael Stewart, how are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
I'm
Anytime.
glad to have you back here. This is a first now for our relatively new podcast, in that you are the first returning guest.
Woo!
We did it.
Came back.
Yes.
That's the thing to say, right? You know. So now we have a little bit of an intro for our guest tonight. The reason for the season, the reason why we are all here, and so we'll dive right into that. We have with us tonight from Toms River, New Jersey, Mr. Riccardi, who is the Director of Research Collections for the Louis Armstrong House Museum and author of What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. He runs the online blog, The Wonderful World of Louis Armstrong, at dippermouth.blogspot.com, and he has given lectures on Armstrong at venues around the world, including the Institute of Jazz Studies, the Satchmo Summerfest, the Bristol International Jazz and Blues Festival, and the Monterey Jazz Festival. He teaches the music of Louis Armstrong graduate course at Queens College, in addition to hosting various listening parties at Jazz at Lincoln Center. And he has recently co-produced Satchmo at Symphony Hall 65th Anniversary, the complete concert for Universal Music and Columbia, and RCA Victor live recordings of Louis Armstrong and the All-Stars for Mosaic Records. He's also the jazz pianist based out of Toms River, New Jersey, and received his master's in jazz history and research from Rutgers. His most recent book on pops, Heart Full of Rhythm, The Big Band Years of Louis Armstrong, is the subject of much of tonight's conversation. So we're going to dive right into this. Mr. Ricky Riccardi, we want to talk about this transition that was occurring in the late 20s, the vice, the opulence, F. Scott Fitzgerald's Lost Generation, the Volstead Act violence, to depression, blues, exoticism, Harlem Renaissance, and just on the verge of a New Deal, in plays Louis Armstrong onto a stage in late 20s New York City. First of all, Ricky Riccardi, welcome to the show. We're excited to have you. I want you to we set a little bit of a flavor there, and I just want you to take it from there and kind of set the stage for where the book begins in this very special time in U.S. history and in Louis Armstrong history.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody. It's just having a ball being here. This is a question that I can go on for a few hours about. I could write a book about the answer to this question.
Right?
I'll try to give you the short version. The book begins at the start of 1929, so it's right before Wall Street lays the egg. And Louis Armstrong is worshipped by musicians and by the cognoscenti in Chicago, but not really by anybody else. He's still kind of an unknown musician. All those records that we genuflect towards today, the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens, those were race records, as they called them back then, aimed at the African American communities. They were moderately popular, but they were pretty much as far from pop music as you can get. But that was changing in 1928, especially with the release of West End Blues. All of a sudden, Armstrong's records were bringing in bigger sales. But he was still recording with that New Orleans group with the trumpet, trombone, clarinet, and banjo and piano. And so OK Records, one of their the heads over there was Tommy Rockwell, and Rockwell was like, "Nah, this sound is never going to do it. This is already an old-fashioned sound, but Louis Armstrong has something different. He won't leave Chicago. He won't stop being a sideman. If I could only get him to New York and get him to record some pop tunes, then I think he'll make a splash." And so Armstrong at first was not interested, but where the book begins, Rockwell gets Armstrong to come to New York for 2 days in March 1929. And it's got all the makings of a movie because he's got all of his mentors there. King Oliver, who's like a father figure to him, is in the audience with tears in his eyes. Fletcher Henderson, who gave him his first job in New York, is the master of ceremonies. Lewis sits in with the band of Louis Russell, who he had played with in New Orleans. A lot of New Orleans musicians in that band, and
And
he
it will
just
become very important for him much later on, right, in this time period taken up by the book.
Yes, Russell becomes his music director in 1935, and they were lifelong friends. And Louis Russell's daughter, Catherine Russell, is a fantastic singer, and I urge everybody to check her out. And she's like the keeper of the flame. She's the greatest. So Armstrong does 2 nights at the Savoy Ballroom, breaks it up. The musicians in Harlem, I never heard anything quite like them. But then he goes in the recording studio and he records "I Can't Give You Anything But Love," and the band plays it in the most pedestrian, you could say Guy Lombardo fashion. The saxophone's just playing the reeds over and over and over again. Lewis does what Lewis does. He changes the rhythm, he changes the melody, he scats, he improvises with the horn, with his voice, transforms it into something new. Rockwell releases it on the Pop series instead of the Rick series, and just like that, Armstrong is a burgeoning pop star. And he comes back to New York in the summer of '29. He doubles in Harlem and on Broadway with the Broadway audience. He knocks them dead every night with "Ain't Misbehaving." Gets a brand new audience, most white theater going audience. They've never seen or heard anything like it. And that's it. The end of the year comes, 1929. Wall Street lays the egg. The Great Depression starts, and it's like the beginning of Louis Armstrong's stardom. The Depression never really affects him. By 1931, he's the biggest selling record artist in the industry, and he never looks back for the next 40 years of his career.
And I mean, it can be very easy for us because, you know, hindsight's 2020. There's so many things about him. There's vocabulary that he plays that we take for granted right now is just basic jazz vocabulary in all, you know, subgenres of jazz. And the thing is sometimes when you're listening to a Louis Armstrong recording, that's the first time. Now, it might not be the first time that was ever created, but Buddy Bolden didn't record that. King Oliver didn't
Right.
record that. Louis said, "I'm going to record." You know what I mean? He's an innovator in so many different ways. And then there's, what was it? Was it shyness? Was it intrepidation? He always seems to have these pivotal moments for a brief period of time. He's saying, you know, I'm going to be loyal to King Oliver. I'm not going to leave Chicago, right? But once he does, it's like all hell breaks loose. It's like, I leave the riverboats. I don't know if I want to do that. You know, the guys I play with, I mean, it's a good gig. He comes to Chicago, and in like 10 minutes, everyone knows who he is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is it just he has this like incredible sense of timing, or he seemed to be somewhat self-aware of his innovative nature?
Yeah. He knew he was great, and that's one of the reasons that we have a house museum and an archives, because you know he was in control of his own story, making these tapes and scrapbooks and documenting his whole life. So don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You know, there's a story I love to tell where you know he would give away money. Oh my God, he'd give away so much money, and musicians in Chicago, his fans in Chicago, whenever they knew he was in town, they would line up at his hotel room, and he would come off the elevator and just start handing money out. And so word got to Armstrong's manager, Joe Glazer, and Glazer called him up, said, "What are you doing? You're going to give all your money away." And Lewis said, "What do I need money for? They're going to write about me in the history books one day." And so, you know, so he knew that. But the other side of the equation is he didn't wake up one day and said, "I am going to change the sound of American popular music, and I'm not going to quit until I'm the top and until I have $1 million." He had very modest aims. I think that comes from his upbringing. His mother always told him, "Don't worry about what the other fella has. Don't, you know, you don't, if you don't need it, you don't have to worry about it or get jealous or anything. Just, just live your life. Just be thankful for the small things." And so to me, I think the highest point is when he joins King Oliver in Chicago. That's actually where he ends his book, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, because I think that was the biggest goal for him. If he could go to the big city,
He's playing with
join,
King.
yeah, join his mentor, all his old New Orleans buddies, and not have to worry about, where the next paycheck's going to come from, where his next meal's going to come from. I mean, New Orleans, he was hungry, he was stealing, he was getting arrested. I mean, those were the most difficult years of his life. So that's where he ends his book. It's like, I have made it, the end. And I think he probably, if he didn't meet Lil, he probably would have been a sideman with King Oliver for like 10 years. I think he was so comfortable there, and he never played over Oliver. He never played higher than him, faster than him, never tried showing him up, but he always needed that little outside help. So the first one was Lil, his second wife, who heard him, made him quit King Oliver and build him as the world's greatest cornetist. I always call her the architect of his career. And then Tommy Rockwell, who gets him off the race records, makes him a pop star. And then, the book also chronicles all these managers, Johnny Collins, Joe Glazer. And so Armstrong's genius was going to get discovered one way or another, but he just needed like that little bit of guidance, somebody to make the decisions, because he could care less about the business end of it. He didn't worry about salaries or income tax. He just wanted to play the horn. So as long as he got
and this his relationship with these managers that was one area that I remotely knew something about Joe Glazer, right? Because he created a big management business, right? So it's hard not to know, Joe Glazer of the mid 20th century, right? But other than that, your book does an excellent job of kind of recounting throughout this whole period, Louis, both the ups and the downs of these relationships, right? Johnny Collins is the first manager, right? And then Joe. How it feels say it again.
I said Rockwell was technically first, and then Collins cuts in on Rockwell. And,
okay.
Okay.
And like, you guys are all just because you can paint a vivid picture far better than the rest of us. I mean, what is going on with this? Is it just is it dumb luck that Louis doesn't end up, with an early fate that we wouldn't want him to see? You know what I mean? Like, it's a colorful portrait.
Yeah, I mean, these are, let's call it what they are. I mean, most of them are gangsters, and Louis gets, he's backstage with guns pointed at him, and he's got bodyguards, and he's going from city to city and being hounded, and those were some of the scariest moments of his life, and he never wanted to go through that again. So Rockwell wasn't so much a gangster, but him and Armstrong obviously have some weird falling out. I haven't been able to pinpoint what happened, but by the summer of 1930, Louis is looking for somebody new. He finds Johnny Collins. Collins had been in vaudeville for about, 30 years or something like that at that point. He was kind of washed up. He was a big booker, but he had alcohol problems, divorces. He was in all the newspapers, Variety, and all the trades. Louis said every time all the wrong reasons. Yeah, every time he got promoted, he would do something to mess it up and get. And so he hooked up with Collins. So Collins leads him to fame. He's recording for OK. He's out in California. He makes his first movie. But then Rockwell gets angry, and Rockwell wanted Louis to come back to New York, and he was supposed to play Connie's Inn. And so Rockwell rounds up some hoodlums in Chicago, and they go to the club. Incredible. Yeah, they try to shake them down for $6,000. One of the hoodlums threatens to burn off Collins' mustache. They don't get it. Collins calls in one of his gangster friends to threaten Rockwell in his hotel room. You better leave by the morning, all this kind of stuff. The next day, Connie's Inn was owned by the Immerman brothers, but there was money from Dutch Schultz in there, and the next thing you know, there's a gangster named Frankie Foster who's in the dressing room holding a gun at Armstrong, saying, "You're going to come to New York tomorrow." And so they have to go on the lam. They end up going down south. They end up going to England. Louis can't relax for 2 or 3 years. Then he gets in this big fight with Collins on the way to England. Collins calls him the N-word. They split up. Louis stays in Europe for about 2 years, and that's where he hits rock bottom. By the end of his European sojourn, his lips are gone. He has no band. Lil, his second wife, is suing him. Collins is forging his name and collecting his royalties. He hadn't put out a record in 2 years, and so that's when he comes back home and he calls Joe Glazer, because he had met Joe Glazer in the 20s. Glazer managed the Sunset Cafe. He had seen Glazer operate around gangsters, and he knew, I quote him in the book at one point, if you want to play ball with a gangster, you need to get a gangster yourself. And so he calls Joe Glazer and says, want to play the trumpet, you have to make this all go away. And it takes some time, but Glazer buys out the contract from Collins. He pays off Lil. He buys Louis Russell's orchestra, gets Armstrong a contract at Decca, gets him a gig on Broadway, gets him covered in Vanity Fair and Esquire, gets him a Bing Crosby movie. And within 1 year, Armstrong is at the top of his career. And so because of that, no human being could say a derogatory word about Joe Glazer and Louis Armstrong's presence. Not his wife, not his best friends. If anybody hinted at it, Louis would curse them up and down. And I paint a pretty, I think, vivid picture of Glazer's faults, especially, I mean,
well,
he's especially
a man that it seems like at different intervals, he wants to kind of rise above some of his more hoodlum background, but that's hard to do, I guess, once you're in the life, right? I mean,
somehow he managed to do it because, I mean, in this digital age we live in now, I mean, all I did was search for every mention of Glazer's name in every newspaper and magazine I could find. And his skeletons in his closet from the Chicago days, getting arrested multiple times, rape charges, this and that, they never come back up in his lifetime. He managed to hide them. And he lived this life where he was a millionaire who had one of the biggest booking companies in the country. Yet in 2021, he doesn't have a Wikipedia page, and he left behind no papers or no traces of evidence. People ask me if we have any Armstrong contract or anything. There's nothing. It was like he is here and he's gone. And I did my best to paint the story, but the wheelings and dealings and connections and money and all that stuff, it'll always be a mystery because he led that kind of, that life. He knew how to stay out of the spotlight.
Well,
Right.
with Louis and Glazer, were there actually written contracts, or was it just kind of like the old-fashioned handshake between those two?
It was, from what we know, it was pretty much a literal handshake.
Yeah.
Louis basically told him, "I want X amount in dollars a week." And people have argued. I get into it in a footnote. One person said it was $1,000 a week. Somebody said it was $500 a week. But Louis said, in that, we're in the Depression, so it was sizable. But Louis said, "I just want that, and you take care. You can take everything else. I don't care. But as long as I get that, I have peace of mind. It's cool." And sure, they must have signed something at some point. If they did, there's no proof of it. But by the 60s, there's a newspaper article. A writer named Jack O'Brien was in Glazer's office when Louis and Lucille stopped by. And Louis told the writer, "Joe, show him the books." And Glazer goes, "I will not." And Louis goes, "Come on, show him the books." And then Glazer got up and he went, and there was all these bank books. And it was like thousands of dollars, all with Louis's name on it. And they started counting it. And Louis apparently was proud kind of watching this. And so Louis almost didn't even know the money he had like at a given time. He wanted to remain on that weekly salary, but he had, he could dip in anytime he wanted. So there are letters that survive from the 50s and 60s for Louis to write to Glazer and say, balled too much in Vegas this week, send me $5,000. Or, "Hey, can you buy my secretary a Cadillac?" And so Glazer would never say no. What do you need? Anything you need. And so we wince at it from a 21st century perspective because it just looks bad. It looks like, white gangster is making millions and the black genius is working 300 nights a year. He doesn't know what he's making. Oh, it's terrible. But I try to paint a fair picture that they both ended up millionaires, and it might not be the kind of thing that we would support in the modern age, but it worked for Louis for the last 36 years of his life. He had peace of mind, he had protection, he had $1 million, he had money, and no more gangsters hounding him in his dressing room. And so it worked for all the problems that we can place on it today. It worked for both men.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's even like the blues musician Lightning Hopkins. For his entire career, he had it where every time he went into the studio to record, it was $100 a song. And that's what he wanted. He's like, just give me $100 a song. And there were other record companies and producers were like, no, we can get you a contract where you can make millions. And he was like, nope, I want $100 a song. That's it.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Wow. Right.
I'll take
Yeah,
my
I
money
mean-
now and I'll take it green and then I'm out of here. Okay. I don't want to hear about these royalties, man. It's like,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, he wouldn't. Yeah, they were like trying to get him like, "Oh, we can get you royalties," and he would refuse. He'd be like, "No, I just want give me my $100, and
Right.
that's it."
Just give me the stability and then let me do my thing, right? It's not a
It's-
bad idea.
Well,
it's hard not to talk about any American phenomenon in this or any time without we touched upon it for a minute, our 21st century sensitivities, right, to race, the race between these two gentlemen,
Sure.
and what that might have played, right? And of course it's jazz, and jazz is always affected by race. It affects race relations. It's impossible not to talk about an American cultural phenomenon without having this, right? And in the context of the time period you're talking about, how much of that, there's so many questions that I want to ask. I mean, Louis transcends this. People try to make a fool of him, and yet the performance, the soulfulness, everything comes out. And this gets to, I think, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, Ricky. I want you to talk about it. But in part, you made this book. I don't want to say as a justification, but to say we've got to rethink this period in his career. What didn't really fully dawn on me as a reader until I read your book was just how he was vilified in various ways during his own time. Like our ideas about this being a weak time, artistically for him. I always thought, well, that came later. No, it's like this time period is where people like, I think about Leonard Feather being on again, off again about the way he's criticizing him. And even the musicians, once we get into the bop era, right. And the sort of like pseudo wars that are going on. I mean, a lot of that was critic based, but and I know you could talk about this a lot, just talk to this point and how it all sort of played out, and where should we put Louis in context today? That's great. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, before we sign off, here is Ricky Riccardi reading the last paragraph of Heart Full of Rhythm, the big band years of Louis Armstrong.
Perhaps the best way to close is with a song. When You're Smiling is a natural choice to sum up Armstrong's mission in life, but perhaps a more appropriate autobiographical text can be found in one of his own compositions. Let the great think I'm small, I can laugh at them all, 'cause I've got a heart full of rhythm.
Take that home, ladies and gentlemen, with each of you tonight. Ricky Riccardi, thank you for coming on and talking about your book, talking about the life of Louis Armstrong. It was a great conversation. We all feel privileged to have joined you on this great Monday night. Cam McLeod, Joshua Michael Stewart, thanks guys for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you enjoyed this show. You have been listening to the SMG Are We Here Yet podcast. I am your host, Scott M. Graves, and have a very good night.
Well, I almost have to answer it starting backwards, because the later years, the 50s and 60s, that's where his audience becomes overwhelmingly white, and he gets vilified often in the black press, and especially the young, more militant African Americans. They looked at him smiling and singing "Hello, Dolly" and rolling his eyes, and they're like, "Well, that guy, that's Uncle Tom." And so my first book, What a Wonderful World, that was just about the last 24 years. And, I was sitting on all these tapes. My day job at the Armstrong Archives, Louis made 700 reel-to-reel tapes in the last 20 years. And I could hear him cursing about race and venting. And you could see how smart he was and how hurt he was, especially at the very end of his life, when he looked out and he saw that, his own people were no longer really with him. And then he kind of lashes out in some private manuscripts, and it's pretty ugly. But that book I wanted to write just so he would have the ability to defend himself, and so people could see just how shrewd he was and how brave he was, telling off Eisenhower and talking about Selma and putting his career on the line. So that was where I was coming from when I wrote the first book. This era, the big band years, I had read a few biographies on Armstrong where other writers started dropping hints that that view of Armstrong started earlier. That in 1929, when he starts recording these pop songs and Guy Lombardo numbers and making these movies, that's when the black audience first said, "Well, we're done with this guy," you know. And so that was the stigma that was kind of anything I was bumping up against was there, and I couldn't shake it. So when I started researching this book, I said, well, the first thing I got to do is go to the black press. Everything's digitized. Let me go to the Pittsburgh Courier. Let me go to the Chicago Defender, New York Amsterdam News, the Baltimore Afro American. How are they covering Louis Armstrong? And that was probably the biggest eye opener that I had in the entire research and writing of the book. Was in this period particularly, the black press is with him. They are cheering him on like Joe Louis. And anytime he makes a movie or breaks a box office record or appears on the radio or featured in a magazine or mentioned in Walter Winchell's column, I mean, it's like block letter headlines. And that was something I wanted to come across because, as you mentioned, the standard criticisms of Armstrong about how, you know, oh, he went commercial and he's not playing from the heart anymore and all this kind of stuff, that's mostly the white jazz critics, starting with Leonard Feather and John Hammond around 1932-33. The black press, they love the big band. It's actually when Armstrong leaves the big band, that's when they have more trouble with the All-Stars group because it sounded like quote-unquote Dixieland and all that stuff. So there's all these issues at play, but there's also seeds of it. You know, at one point, Armstrong makes Pennies from Heaven. There's a debate in the black press about whether or not this role is actually progress or not. And so I quote heavily from that. So there's the seeds of some people who are going to have some problems with Armstrong's personality. But for the most part, I mean, especially the theater, the Apollo Theater, the audiences, African Americans were with him 100% of the way. And so I wanted to really lean on that and say, okay, Armstrong did have his issues later on. He was hurt by it. Let's not forget him standing up for himself. Let's also not forget that in this period, he's the first African American to, you know, have featured billing in a Hollywood film, first African American to host a nationally sponsored radio show, first African American to do its own announcing in New Orleans, first interracial recording duet with Hoagie Carmichael, one of the first integrated records with Jack Teagarden, first African American jazz musician to published an autobiography in 1936. He's starring on Broadway. He's touring the South. He's going to England. And the hell he has to deal with, getting arrested, getting molested, you know, all this stuff that he has to go through just being black in this time period. And to emerge from that, it's deep. It's really deep. And so I just...
That's the thing. I mean, like like all African American, not just entertainers of the time, but African Americans, period, the indignities that they are dealing with, sometimes one on top of the other within minutes, and they're serious. Yeah. And sometimes they even violent. Josh had a moment, if you would indulge us, that he was hoping you would read from, is it page 87?
Yes, page 87.
I'm going to assume you have a copy of your book somewhere in your house.
Hold on. I got it. Page 87.
I thought you were going to make the picture of Pops in the background go away, and there's just like
the jump picture in the book.
All right. What would you like? What would you like?
Page 87, starting with a most striking example occurred.
Charles Black. Yep.
Yeah, and going down to the segregation in schools.
You got it. All right. The audiobook.
You're right.
A most striking example occurred in Austin, Texas in late September. This is 1931, when Armstrong played a dance at the University of Texas. 16-year-old Charles Black was one of many in attendance, later admitting that he wasn't even there for the music, but rather to meet girls. Black was on the prowl when Armstrong began to play. His life changed right then and there. He was the first genius I'd ever seen, he wrote. The moment of first knowing oneself to be in the presence of genius is a solemn moment. It is perhaps the moment of final and indelible perception of man's utter transcendence of all else created. It is impossible to overstate the significance of a 16-year-old Southern boy seeing genius for the first time in a black. Black had been around some African Americans who were honored and venerated in that paradoxical white Southern way. This was different. But genius, fine control over total power, all height and depth forever and ever, it had simply never entered my mind. For confirming or denying in conjecture that I would see this for the first time in a black man. You don't get over that. You stay young a while longer with the hesitations, the incertitudes, the half obediences to crowd pressure of the young. But you don't forget. One of Black's friends, a good old boy, could only look at Armstrong, shake his head, and say, after all, he's nothing but a goddamn N-word. Black and his friend parted ways. Every person of decency in the South of those days must have had some doubts about racism, and I had mine even then, perhaps more than most others, he wrote. But Lewis opened my eyes wide and put me to a choice. Blacks, the saying went, were all right in their place. What was the place of such a man and of the people from which he sprung? His mind wide open, Black's course of life changed after hearing Armstrong. He became a famed professor of constitutional law and in 1954 helped Thurgood Marshall write the legal briefs in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which helped bring an end to segregation in schools. Armstrong's tour of the South and similar ones he would undertake in ensuing years must have made many white Southerners question their feelings on race, as when confronted with genius in a black man for the first time, they too could not help but admit him with a smile.
He's always transcending this issue, deeply embedded issue, and then it's just astounding that he could live his lifetime. And it obviously bothered him, but it didn't permanently embitter him, it seems, in any way. The man still not only had his dignity and his pride, but he was loved and beloved because he was just such a real person to everybody around. He glows with this.
Yeah, Armstrong had a innate ability to always see the best in people, and he says in one of his manuscripts that you had to earn his disrespect. You know, he didn't prejudge anybody. If he met a white guy, if he met a Southerner, if he met someone foreign, whatever, he didn't go in there with any preconceived notions. If they opened their mouth and they were racist or hurtful, well, then he'd have an enemy for life. But he always went in there trying to be optimistic. And when it came to race, there are multiple stories where he would almost take pity on the racist. There's a story that his buddy Jack Bradley tells, and this is later. I mean, Jack Bradley toured with Lewis in 1960. He was just his pal, his personal photographer, and they were going from New York to Boston. Jack was from the Cape Cod area, so he decided to go along and stopped somewhere up in New England, and Lewis couldn't use the bathroom at a certain place, and they knew who he was. It's like, sorry, and this is 1960. And Lewis got back on the bus, and Jack was all fuming and, like, how can this happen to you? Oh, my God. It was just calm. It was like, and I think he said, that cat hasn't figured out what life's about yet. And so it was almost like, instead of any anger or I know who I am or anything like that, it was like, man, this guy, he thinks he knows what's important. He thinks he did the right thing. He hasn't figured it out. I really feel bad for that guy. And if you could look at the world like that, that's why he's Louis Armstrong. It comes through in the music. It comes through everywhere. It's just that positive spirit. It's undeniable.
And he's synthesizing it, right? I mean, back when Jimmy Rogers is Jimmy Rogers, he's going to record a tune with Jimmy Rogers, right? He's doing country. You mentioned Guy Lombardo several times, which in the book you say, like, he was proud of all of that. He's like, yeah, we're playing popular tunes. People want to hear popular music. We're just going to play music, right? And we're going to, but yet he's always himself, his sense of rhythm, obviously the vocabulary, like we mentioned earlier. He's synthesizing in ways, and at a time when there isn't a lot of people, certainly not at his level of fame, that are doing this.
No, this is one of the mind-boggling things about Armstrong. I always say it's why he's the most perfect figure to be, like, the defining figure of the 20th century, because growing up in New Orleans, when folks talk about early New Orleans, early roots of jazz and ragtime and all that stuff, it's mostly just the blues and vernacular music, and they played stomps and they played rags, and it's just like a single-minded thing. And Lewis's childhood, I mean, he does do that, of course, but he's buying Caruso records. He's listening to John McCormick and Henry Burr. He's listening to marching band music, and the brass bands, they would play Sousa marches and stuff. He's got the Jewish family, the Kronofsky family. They're singing Yiddish lullabies to him, and then he would say he would go back to his side of the town and start singing like that, and they didn't want to hear it. It was like too pretty. They wanted to hear the blues, and so you know, he's just like the right guy at the right time to kind of just realize, oh my God, there's all this music. And I'm not going to categorize it. I'm going to steal a little bit from everything and make my own sound. And so through the 20s, race records, the people who made the race records who were mostly white producers, they thought that all the black audience wanted to hear were blues and stomps and instrumental jazz, and so that's why we have our hot fives and hot sevens. They're great. But in his day-to-day life, Lewis is playing with, Erskine Tate's band. He's doing Cavalier Rusticana. He's playing Noel Coward's Poor Little Rich Girl. He's playing Just Like a Butterfly Standing in the Rain, and all these pop tunes and love songs. Sweethearts on Parade. In 1928, Guy Lombardo comes to Chicago, and they make sure they hear him every night. And so when Lewis is finally allowed to branch out a bit and record pop tunes and love songs and with Lombardo bands and Hawaiian bands and anything else, he is completely himself and he's completely at home. But by that point, it's the jazz critics, mostly the white jazz critics, are saying, no, 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 you're betraying your roots. You need to only play blues and stomps and ragtime. And so it's this thing, where you get this white and it goes on later. Gunther Schuller and all the ethnomusicologists, they know Armstrong's a genius, but it's just like this poor guy loses his way in 1929. And what a waste of a career. And to me, as much as I love the 1920 stuff and would never say a disparaging word about it, I think things get more interesting in 1929. Like hearing him apply his talents to all this kind of stuff. And, I've said this before, but the interesting thing is usually the way music is discussed, it's like, black innovation is followed by white imitation. So you get Lewis in the 20s, and then you have Benny Goodman doing the swing era in the 30s, and you have, Little Richard doing Tutti Frutti, and then you have Pat Boone doing Tutti Frutti, and that's usually just how these things go. You have Muddy Waters first, here comes the Rolling Stones. This is like the reverse, where Lewis gets indoctrinated into this lily white pop world where all the crooners have these nasal voices and all the arrangements have these moaning saxophones, and he blows it up from the inside. He's like, I'm going to use my gifts, my undeniable African American sense of swing and rhythm and storytelling and improvisation and scatting and everything else. And I'm going to use the same arrangements and the same songs and the same stuff Rudy Valley's doing and the same stuff Guy Lombardo's doing, but I'm going to do it my way. And after a couple of years of that, there was no going back. Everything. In the book, I mentioned everybody from Billie Holiday to Sam Cooke to Ray Charles. I think it all comes from this period, especially 29 to 33, where he turns the whole pop sound on its head. Nothing's ever the same since.
And do you think he influenced guys like, business-wise, guys like Benny Carter, who really paved, before Quincy Jones had his movie composition career, Benny Carter paved the way for that, right? Or Sam Cooke, you just mentioned Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke really intentionally wanted to be his own impresario and create what, MBA programs would call a vertically integrated, industry, right? He's doing that, right? Louis was doing this decades before anybody else, and he was just doing it, regardless of people saying yes, no, or whatever. He was just doing it.
Exactly. That's why I hope the book paints him as bigger than just a trumpet player. I feel like there is this stigma on Armstrong sometimes that he's just a genius trumpet player. And when he is taught in music schools and jazz conservatories, they analyze the notes and the solos and the improvisations, and oh man, he played this arpeggio off that chord and no one was doing that. All right, yeah, he is that. That's great. But to navigate that world and the songs and the bands and the showmanship, the book is a lot about showmanship and comedy and entertainment and pyrotechnics and hitting high notes and making it look hard on stage and getting crowds whipped up into a frenzy. It's all of that I think, the total picture, plus race and gangsters and drugs and indignities and bad press and good press. It's just, somebody had to be first. Somebody had to go out there and do it first before your Sam Cookes and Ray Charles and everybody else. And so, God bless the trumpet playing and the music and all that. It's all there. It's all described heavily in the book. But I wanted to just back up a little bit and try to get the total picture of what it meant for this man, this African American man, to make these accomplishments in this time period. It's just, there was nothing else like it.
Josh, you turned me on to Louis Armstrong when we were kids.
Yeah.
And I've never asked you this. I mean, what got you into him in the first place, and what kept you listening to him?
Well, I actually was into Louis Armstrong before I was into jazz. Like most kids our age, probably the first Louis Armstrong tune I heard was, What a Wonderful World. But a lot of it had to do with my father. My dad met Bing Crosby on a beach in 1969. My mother was born in the same town as Rosemary Clooney. So like White Christmas was religion. Like we watched it all the time. So I had that Bing Crosby connection first. And then at some point I heard It's a Wonderful World, and I, liked the tune, liked the song, again, before I was even into jazz. And then in our freshman year music class, for whatever reason, I don't even know why he did it, but Garber played the 1956 film High Society that had Lewis and Bing Crosby. So, and that was like love at first sight. And it's still one of my all-time favorite films. And that's where it started. Then I heard Ella Fitzgerald, and I fell in love with Ella Fitzgerald. The first thing I heard from her was the Roger and Hart songbook, and then of course that led to the Verve duets that she did with Louis, which are masterpieces. And it came from there.
Cool. Yeah, and I think like so many people now, generations, right? Our first Louis Armstrong, it's almost like you start at the end and then you work your way backwards. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the more serious you get about jazz, the earlier you go back. And his career is such a, I mean, it's 50 plus years, so, or 50 or whatever it is, 53 years of recording time or whatever. And there's virtually every type of 20th century American music within his discography.
Right.
You're going to find something that you can appreciate and like and feel. He's just such he becomes a soundtrack to so many moments in your life. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? There's a tune in there for virtually everything. And we've sort of shared that both as musicians, but then just as adult men.
Yeah. Well, and also too,
we send each other recordings of a tune.
Yeah.
Louis Armstrong, that's sort of like it, epitomizes what we can't say with words, I guess,
Yeah, well, right when I was just getting in jazz too. So there was the same year, probably within the same few months, I saw, the High Society movie, and then I saw the Clint Eastwood Bird, the biopic of Charlie Parker. So then I went to Strawberries. Remember Strawberries, the record store?
Oh, when you buy records.
Huh?
When you could buy records.
Yeah, when you can actually buy. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to buy my first jazz records. And the first 2 CDs I bought was a Verve Charlie Parker compilation and Louis Armstrong's Greatest Hits. And the Greatest Hits I bought, I don't even think I think it's out of print now, but like it has like 10 songs, and 5 out of the 10 are duets he did with Bing Crosby. So that was all the more. And I still have both of those albums, and I still play them like on the regular.
Ricky, you got into, I want you to talk a little bit about how you got into doing what you do now. Because what you do now is like this passion project that's turned into a career and then some. And we're all living in the zombie apocalypse. So we all are now following each other through, the lens of various social media platforms. It's very heartening to see like you and enjoying your family and your wife all the time and stuff. And it's like, this is just wonderful. You know what I mean? So talk to us a little bit about that, how things are going. Obviously, this book is taking off big time. I mean, every day there's some other review of the book, of your work. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I don't take any of it for granted. Like anytime a review comes in, there's always part just like, do I need to share everything on Facebook or Instagram or whatever? But it's just like I'm legitimately filled with wonder. Oh my God, this person really liked it. I'm so proud. Yeah, this is great. Because just to give you the short version of how I got here, it's funny. There's something about that 15-year-old freshman year age. That's when me, I saw Lewis and the Glenn Miller story when I was 15, and that just knocked me out. And the first greatest hits I listened to was a 1950s Columbia compilation, and that was the one defining moment. I was like, all right, nothing is ever going to be the same. But then when I would read about Armstrong, I would keep bumping into these theories that he was basically washed up in 1929. He hits this pinnacle of West End blues in 28, and the rest of his career is commercial, showbiz, love songs, selling out, blah, blah. And so I was in high school when I said, all right, I got my career path. I'm going to write a book and dispute. How do I do that? And so flash forward, I got a master's in jazz history and research. And so, as you can imagine, not the most burgeoning field out there. I got my master's degree. I had a 350-page thesis on Louis Armstrong's later years. I graduated in May of 05, got married in June of 05, and put together my resume, and I had the whole thing. I was going to write a book. I was going to teach. I was going to play a little piano on the side, and life was going to be a dream. And while I was doing that, I said, I'll go back and I'll help my old man out. The only job I'd ever done since sophomore year in high school, my summer job was always painting houses for my father. He was a painting contractor here in Jersey. And so I started painting houses and didn't stop painting houses for 4 full years. And in that period, the first book was probably rejected. I hired an agent, but it was rejected about 50 times. He would just email me once a week. Yep, we got rejected by, Doubleday. Yep, got rejected by St. Martin's. And so, it was pretty dark. And I think that's why I have this kind of positive spirit to this day, because it was a weird time because my parents, my father would say, I didn't put you through college to be a house painter. My wife would get nervous. She was like, why don't you try teaching or elementary school or something? Or they have you thought of self-publishing. And for some weird reason, I was always super calm. I was like, this is important. This, this, I just got to see it through. I just got to see it through. And then it was like, my agent called me one day, boom, we got a book deal with Pantheon. I'd started this Armstrong blog, started giving lectures in New Orleans, and then I started doing a lot of research at the Louis Armstrong archives. And I predicted to my wife the first day we went there, I'm going to work there one day. In 2009, the founder, Michael Cogswell, said, we have a grant coming up to hire an archivist for 2 years. And I had no archives training. I was a trained journalist. But I said, if I'm ever going to work anywhere, it's there. And so I applied for it and got the job. So that was 2009. And so, like I said, that was 12 years ago, and I'm still at the job. So being in charge of Louis Armstrong's archives, listening to all of his tapes, being the one who has to open the safe to get the trumpets out, that I don't take for granted. And then teaching this Music of Louis Armstrong course and getting to just preach for 15 weeks and get listening assignments and all that stuff. Oh my God, it's thrilling. And writing the 2 books, which I soon hope to turn into 3 books, that's kind of what started me on this path. So obviously I'm very proud of that. And then there's this whole moonlighting career as a producer, a record producer, which I never intended. I didn't even know what a record producer was or did. I would just see names on CDs. But Universal contacted me 10 years ago for the first time to help them put together a track list for a 10 CD set. And I knocked it out very quickly. And they said, hey, do you have any other Armstrong ideas? And so between 2012 and 2018, everything that came out from Universal, about 6 or 7 releases, digital and CD, I got to co-produce. And then with Mosaic Records, I put out one set in 2014, and we have another set coming out April of this year, which is the exact music that changed my life when I was 15. And so put it all together, I still wake up every day feeling like that house painter with the master's degree, just kind of like, and so it's just pinch myself every day that I get to do this.
It sounds like it exemplifies, it's a Louis way to live. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to compare myself to Louis Armstrong, but it's, I will say that I guess I use words like preaching and sermons and stuff like that, but it does feel like a religion sometimes. I'm not saying that he's infallible. I always cover his flaws and all that stuff, but there was something about his mindset, like we talked about earlier, of never needing $1 million, never needing to be the best or the greatest, just always having a positive spirit, always treating people with respect, just being thankful to be able to do anything. I get a lot of that from him, that's for sure.
Cool.
This seems he was very, very genuine. Like who you saw on screen was who you saw. He might have had more colorful words backstage, but you pretty much had this. It was the same guy. It's
I think
it's not like where you hear about like Bing Crosby, who was supposed to be the Mr. Christmas and all that, but was very aloof and
right.
and other things. With
no,
like you got what you got.
that's the recurring theme of both of these books, because I do think that's where a lot of the criticism stemmed from, especially in the 50s and 60s, because people who didn't take the time to like hang out with him, all they saw was the onstage persona, and they just, I think John Lewis, genius pianist, the modern jazz quartet, but he hammered Armstrong after seeing him in Newport in 1960. He's like, he's all fake, going out there and jumping around on stage. He's just doing that because he thinks it makes the audience happy, but nobody can do that. Nobody can be that way, and it's all fake. And so I just think that persona rubs so many people the wrong way. Well, at the Armstrong Archives, we have these 700 reel-to-reel tapes, and you hear Lewis off stage, you hear him with friends, you hear him with family, and it's the same guy. He's the life of the party. He's laughing the loudest. He's telling the dirtiest jokes. He's just, and whether it's with kids, with fans, with anybody, he is so genuine, so incredibly, warm. Everybody I interviewed for both books, and then everybody Terry Teachout interviewed for his book, Pops. Me and Terry were good friends, and we compared notes once. Nobody could say a bad word. Nobody could say one bad word about Louis Armstrong. Now, the Archives does have him on tape, as you mentioned, Josh, cursing, holding grudge, getting angry. He was a human being. He was, a man. So, in anybody who expected him to be smiling like that 24 hours a day, it's not there. But the warmth, the genuine spirit, it's, he couldn't do that on stage if it wasn't real. Everybody would have known it was phony. He just loved every day of his life. It really seemed that way.
So what I want to know is, what was it like that first time you held one of those reels in your hand? and you listened to those home recordings for the very first time?
No,
I would have had a panic attack.
Yeah, it's a funny story, because I got my master's at Rutgers Newark, which is the home of the Institute of Jazz Studies. So for my 2 years there, I interviewed every surviving member of the All-Stars, and then I basically photocopied the clippings file at the Institute of Jazz Studies. Had a huge Armstrong file. Anytime he was mentioned in a magazine, a newspaper, whatever, and before smartphones, I would just sit there at the copier and just copy. And then I wrote this 350-page thesis, and I was proud of it. But a lot of it was me, saying Louis was tough, and Louis was still great, and Louis was playing better, and Louis was smart, and Louis didn't care about style and all whatever. So I graduate 05. January of 06 was the first time I went to the Armstrong Archives, and my wife and I did the House Museum and the Archives in one day, and we got there very late. It was like 4:30, and they said, well, we closed at 5. I said, oh God. I said, all I want to do is hear one of these tapes. And so they brought me a big binder, and the binder was massive, and I didn't have time to read it. And so I got to like reel 14. I'm like, oh, this sounds interesting. It was an interview in Benton, and they brought me. They had copied the CD, so they brought me the CD, and it was only a half-hour interview, and in that half hour, Armstrong, I'm playing better than ever, and these people about styles and blah blah. I mean, and he was so tough and strong and opinionated, but right on. And that was the moment I realized that's what was missing. I was missing him. And, his opinions could have been completely different, and then I would have had to change my whole thesis, my whole narrative. But it turns out that, I guess I predicted it well, but I was able to get me out of the story and get him in there. And so both books, over the next several years as a researcher, I listened to dozens of tapes. And then when I got the job, because they were all transferred to CD, it became one of my favorite parts of the job. I would show up in the morning, grab like 6 CDs, and go about my work, which, the work of an archivist could be deadly boring sometimes, numbering photographs, numbering folders, putting stuff in sleeves. But I would have those CDs playing in the background all day, and I would hear something like, oh, I would make a note, go back to CD 37. That interview is on fire. And so it took 2 or 3 years, but I think me and Louis Armstrong are the only two people who have listened to every one of those tapes. So that is the probably the main thing I want to get across in both these books. I wanted him to speak for himself, because I feel like he went through the trouble of making this archive and making these tapes and trying to be in control of his own story. We shouldn't sit there and ignore that. There's other Armstrong biographers who got kind of wrapped up in kind of preconceived notions, and they had to be this way, and he had to feel this way. And it's like, no, just listen to the tapes. It's all there, good, the bad, and the ugly. You can still disagree with him, but at least I'm giving him a platform. At least the books lean so heavily on his own feelings that whether or not it sways you or changes your mind or whatever, it doesn't matter, because at least you know how he felt. That's what I'm trying to get across.
There's something so very intimate about that, that he kept those tapes. I mean, it's like you're sitting in the room with it. It's the closest we're going to get to sitting in the room with him, right? And he's just, sometimes he's being interviewed, but sometimes it's public, but sometimes it's just him telling you what he's thinking at that moment, or he's talking with friends, and they can be disarmed, and it just I got to imagine it just creates this whole other much more thredimensional picture of man.
Yeah, I feel like I know him better than I know some family members. Listening to all those tapes, all there.
Now, with that said, would there be a chance that these tapes will ever be collected in like let's say like a mosaic box set of any kind?
Potentially. There's all sorts of rights issues, as you can imagine, and some of the tapes are pretty risque. There was a 2 CD set that came out in 2008. One CD was all music, and one CD was the quote unquote best of the spoken word tapes. That was before I worked there. So Michael Cogswell really chose carefully. He chose some amazing stuff, but it's all pretty G-rated, and it covers a lot of bases, but it just kind of whets the appetite. So there would have to be the right company and the rights holders and the Armstrong estate. Everybody would have to be on board with putting all this out there. Having said that, I need to get my plug-in for the digital collections of the Louis Armstrong House Museum, because this is something that we launched with a bang in 2018, and I still don't think people quite realize what's there. We have the world's largest archives for any single jazz musician, because in addition to the tapes and Lewis's stuff, we have 12 separate collections, Jack Bradley collection and all these other collections. And so in 2016, we received a $2.7 million grant from Robert Smith's Fund to Foundation to digitize the entire collection. And it was a 2-year process, the most crazy 2 years of my life, but we digitized over 60,000 assets, and we put together a website, collections.louisarmstronghouse.org. And the point of the website was to give people the experience of coming to Queens College and doing research, but you can do it from anywhere at any time, without making that trek. This is way before COVID. We ended up being ahead of our time. But what I'm getting at is, if you go to that website, collections.louisarmstronghouse.org, hit the login button, hit the register button and create an account, fill everything in there, you can legitimately listen to every tape, every single reel-to-reel tape, good, bad, and ugly. You can watch concert videos, you can listen to recordings, you can read scrapbook pages, you can read joke books, you can read. It's all there, uncensored.
The joke
Yeah, oh yeah, the joke book's there. So how, how we protect it, nothing's there for download. We get people who write us every day like, hey, can I have a copy of that tape? No, sorry, I don't want to get fired. Every tape has a beep. It beeps every 15, 20 seconds. Yeah, we made it a very soft beep, so it's not jarring, but just enough to prevent commercialization or playing on the radio or internet or anything. Same thing, all the photos, all the documents, all have Louis Armstrong House Museum watermarks around the middle. We had to protect it, but
Right.
we didn't want to leave anything out. So if I'm talking about these tapes and everything that we've discussed tonight, go to that site, search in whatever you can dream of, and you can listen to the 700 plus tapes right from your living room or your phone. It's pretty unbelievable.
That is, yeah, and
That's
that's really
amazing.
great that you protected it in a way that it's there for the academic community, for anybody and all, to have access to and really discover. I got to imagine they're not just discovering Louis Armstrong, but they're discovering a time period that they're getting a lot of context, in a real
Yeah,
personal.
man. That's one of the great things about the tapes too, because people just think, oh well, it's Louis Armstrong talking about music. But half the tapes, I would say, are either mixtapes or Louis recording the radio, Louis recording TV, and so audio of the radio broadcast of Sugar Ray Robinson knocking out Jake LaMotta, or I think the Democratic National Convention of 1952, or 2 hours of country western radio in Pasadena, or he recorded one radio station at 5 in the morning. He got the kids show. He's just up at night. I think you hear him, he doesn't talk about it or anything. He's in the room. You hear him typing, or whatever. But so there's all these snapshots at like the world, of that period. TV commercials, radio commercials. What is he listening to? It's just, the spoken word stuff is obviously the meat, but there's so much there that takes you right into the room with him. It's stunning.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite stories of the tapes is when he was having a fight with Lucille, and she's like, "Are you recording this?" And he's like, "Yep." And she's like, "Turn it off." And he's like, "Nope."
That's the most important tape in the entire collection because they go to war. It's like a 10-minute argument, and she doesn't know that he's recording it. And I can't even quote what they say in that argument. But when she discovers it, she tells him to turn it off, and he says, "No, it's for posterity."
Yeah.
And that two-word phrase, that's the most important phrase in the entire archives, because that's why we have an archives.
Right.
Because I once played that for a class, and a student raised his hand and said, "Why would he say that?" He does not come out looking great in that argument, and it's like for posterity. He's not hiding anything. He knows one day, someone like me who's born 9 years after he died is going to listen to this stuff. I want to judge him, warts and all. Why present just your social media feed, you at your best and all that stuff. And these tapes include a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Well, before we end, Riccardi, I was hoping that you could read the final paragraph of the book, because I think, it perfectly encapsulates, it's a good ending for a book, but it also, I think, perfectly encapsulates the conversation that we just had. And before you do so, I want to thank my good buddy, my best friend in the whole world, Joshua Michael Stewart, great writer from Western Mass.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. And Ricky, this was an absolute honor to be here with you. So thank you for indulging us.
Oh, the feeling's mutual. Josh has been such a big supporter, and what he did for my first book is still an absolute knockout. If no one knows the poem.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, but I ruined your book. I have to get another copy.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Cam, as always.
It was great to listen. It was great to Louis Armstrong. I really became introduced to Louis Armstrong and to this level from Scott. So just being here and learning all this stuff, and I know I'm gonna have to start listening because I'm a big podcaster, and so this will be the the thing to replace it. Listen to some of these tapes so I can truly get a feel and learn more of this stuff. And I'll have to pick up a copy of both your books at this point now. Thank you for coming on.
My
So
pleasure.
what happens? We spread the word. People get into it.
It keeps me going. There's very few artists born in 1901 who still have this level of interest. Because taking me out of the equation, I mean, the Armstrong House, we are opening a $23 million Louis Armstrong Center that should be open later this summer. Construction's been ongoing since 2017. Ron Howard's Imagine, they're doing a big budget theatrical documentary. There's whispers of a biopic. And like I said, I know I'm teasing. I have nothing official to announce, but I do want to complete the trilogy and write one more book. And so, about 1901 to 1928. So, I mean, God bless them all. Armstrong's generation, Bing Crosby, Duke Ellington, Al Jolson, all of these heavyweights, they're all slipping. We know them because we live this era and that music. But the average person on the street might not know who they are to the extent anymore. Louis Armstrong, I think 11, 12 million listens on Spotify every month and all this other stuff going on. He's only getting bigger. It's been 50 years since he died this July, and it's like, have me on in 50 more years, and I guarantee you it'll be like, undisputed. I've always said, we're heading to the point where it's going to be, who are the greats? Shakespeare, Mozart, Louis Armstrong. No one will argue it at that point. So we're on our way.
Nice.
I did have one question. I'm sorry to keep this going on, but I did have one question. For one book that I think needs to be written that hasn't been written, so maybe this might be your fourth book, is I am a writer and all that, but as my day job for the last 20 years, I've been a counselor for the disabled. And I would really love to see a book written about specifically just his relationship with his adoptive son.
Yeah.
That's a story that needs to be told.
Yes, Clarence has been mentioned briefly in both the first books, but the next book will deal with his birth, and I would like to dig a little deeper, because there are stories of Clarence lived till 1998, and there are stories of him in the 70s after Louis died, him on TV and all that stuff. So it might not be book length, but there will be a lot more Clarence in my next volume. That relationship is special. We have a tape of the two of them together, ordering Chinese food and telling jokes in 1951. Oh, it's pure all love. So, yeah, thank you for that. I'll make sure that Clarence plays a big role in the next book.
Awesome.
That's great. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, before we sign off, here is Ricky Riccardi reading the last paragraph of Heart Full of Rhythm, the big band years of Louis Armstrong.
Perhaps the best way to close is with a song. When You're Smiling is a natural choice to sum up Armstrong's mission in life, but perhaps a more appropriate autobiographical text can be found in one of his own compositions. Let the great think I'm small, I can laugh at them all, 'cause I've got a heart full of rhythm.
Take that home, ladies and gentlemen, with each of you tonight. Ricky Riccardi, thank you for coming on and talking about your book, talking about the life of Louis Armstrong. It was a great conversation. We all feel privileged to have joined you on this great Monday night. Cam McLeod, Joshua Michael Stewart, thanks guys for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you enjoyed this show. You have been listening to the SMG Are We Here Yet podcast. I am your host, Scott M. Graves, and have a very good night.